7 clay tablets. That is the complete surviving record of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation text that names the Anunnaki and reaches further back into divine prehistory than most modern retellings follow. 7 fired clay rectangles, each roughly the size of a human palm, recovered from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh between 1848 and 1876. The story pressed into their surface is not simply about gods who shape the world. It is about gods who were themselves created fourth-generation inheritors of a cosmos assembled from forces far older and stranger than anything they commanded. What were those forces? And what, if anything, called them into being? Tonight, this space follows the question embedded in those tablets, not the familiar names of the Anunnaki, but the older names behind them. We will move through 4 traces. The first traces the divine genealogy itself, the generations before Anu, before Enlil, before Enki, the primordial pairs the Babylonian scribes described as the true parents of all divine power. The second follows Tiamat through her transformation from cosmic mother to cosmic enemy, and the political theology that may have reshaped her image across centuries. The third listens for an astronomical layer encoded beneath the mythology, in the possibility that priests who mapped the heavens from ziggurat platforms wrote what they observed into the names and battles of their gods. And the fourth rests with the question that even the oldest tablets could not answer: if the primordial waters preceded everything what preceded the primordial waters. We will not resolve any of this tonight. That is not what this space is for. The evening may already be settling around you. If you have found a position that feels close to restful, stay there. Nothing in what follows requires your full attention, only whatever part of you still listens when the mind begins to loosen its hold on the day. The tablets we are following were not written for casual readers. They were composed and recopied by scribes working in institutions called Aduba tablet houses, where students learned cuneiform by reproducing texts already generations old. The physical act of pressing a reed stylus into wet clay required a specific angle of pressure and a specific rotation of the wrist. The clay held the impression or it did not. Correction meant a new tablet. Oil lamps threw soft light across the work. Generation after generation of hands performed the same motions, preserving the same words, passing forward a record of origins they themselves could not verify. What those scribes copied night after night were accounts of a cosmos that had existed long before their own civilization. The Enuma Elish they preserved was already old when Babylon rose to prominence under Hammurabi, around 1792 BCE. The Sumerian sources it drew upon were older still, and certain tablets from Nippur dated to around 1500. BCE contain a phrase that gives even experienced scholars pause. The scribe who wrote them describes his own sources as ancient. People living 4,000 years ago were already reaching backward towards something they could not quite touch. Here is a detail that suggests the scale of what remains unknown. Scholars estimate that more than 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been physically recovered from Mesopotamian sites. Of those, only a fraction have been fully translated and studied. The cosmological texts we rely on, the ones naming Tiamat, Apsu, Lahmu, and Lahamu, Anshar, and Kishar, represent glimpses through narrow windows into libraries that were mostly lost before modern archaeology began. By one reasonable estimate, what survives may constitute around 5% of what once existed. We are reading, in other words, not the record, but the shadow of the record. That shadow is still considerable, and what it preserves is a vision of cosmic origins that differs sharply from what popular culture tends to assume about ancient Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki appear relatively late in the divine genealogy the tablets construct. The scribes were explicit, they were inheritors. The cosmos was already ancient by the time the Anunnaki assumed their positions within it. Before them came Anu, the sky. Before Anu came Anshar and Kishar, the horizon gods, whole sky and whole earth, the first differentiation of vertical space into above and below. Before them came Lahmu and Lahamu, names that suggest sediment and deposit, the first trembling separation of form from formlessness. And before all of these, only 2 presences, Tiamat, the salt sea, and Apsu, the freshwater abyss, mingling without boundary in a universe that had not yet learned to name itself. The oldest Sumerian sources reach back further still. In texts predating the Babylonian Enuma Elish by centuries, a figure called Namu appears the primordial sea, addressed in a hymn from Nippur as the mother who gave birth to all the gods. No tablet records her origin. Within the theological imagination of the scribes who wrote about her, she had none. She simply was. The question of what existed before her was not answered. It may have been understood from the beginning as unanswerable. This is where the traditions diverge without resolving anything. The Greeks circled the same silence and called it chaos. The Hebrews wrote of Tehom, a word linguists trace directly to Tiamat through documented phonetic descent. The Neoplatonists described the one beyond name and form, from which all else emanated downward in diminishing light. Each tradition offered a different name for the same darkness at the edge of the genealogy. None of them looked into it and came back with an answer. What the Babylonian priests understood, and what the patient genealogies of the tablets preserve, is that the gods you might recognize, the gods who demanded temples and offerings and human labour, were not the source. They were downstream from something else, something that left no inscription, something the oldest records describe only by pointing toward it and falling quiet. Tonight we begin with what was written. We follow the genealogy backward into the names before the familiar names, into the silence the oldest texts describe as the beginning. The first trace descends. The library that was not supposed to survive. In the summer of 1853, a young Assyrian digger working for the British archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam broke through a mud brick wall in the northern mound at Kuyunjik, the ancient city of Nineveh, and found himself standing in a room that had been sealed for approximately 24 centuries. The floor was covered not in rubble or sand, but in clay. Thousands upon thousands of inscribed tablets, some whole most fragmented layered dough, across each other in a deposit that reached knee-height in certain corners. The room smelled of nothing. Fired clay, preserved in the dry heat beneath the Mesopotamian earth, carries no scent. It simply waits, holding its impressions with a patience that organic materials cannot match. What Rassam's team had uncovered was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who ruled from approximately 668 to 627 BCE. Ashurbanipal was unusual among ancient monarchs in that he was genuinely literate, capable of reading and composing cuneiform script at a time when such skills had belonged almost exclusively to professional scribes. He was also, by all available evidence, obsessive about texts. His agents travelled across Mesopotamia with standing orders to locate copy, and in some cases confiscate tablets from temple archives, private collections, and older royal libraries. The result was the most comprehensive archive of ancient knowledge the world had yet assembled. Tens of thousands of texts covering medicine, astronomy, divination, law, mathematics, myth, and theology gathered into a single institution in the capital of an empire that would collapse within a generation of his death. The library burned when Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces in 612 BCE. The fire did something the scribes who built the library could not have anticipated. It baked the clay tablets that the flames touched, hardening them further, making them more durable against the millennia near ahead. The library that burned was simultaneously preserved by its burning. The texts that survived were in a strange and unplanned way protected by the very catastrophe that ended the civilization that created them. Destruction and preservation arrived together inseparable in the same event, which is perhaps an appropriate origin story for material that deals at its core with the question of what endures when everything surrounding it is gone. Among the tablets recovered from that deposit were 7 that, when assembled and studied by the British Museum curator George Smith in the early 1870s, turned out to constitute the most complete surviving version of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative that opens with the universe unnamed and closes with the world ordered, as the Mesopotamians understood it. Smith was a self-taught scholar who had begun his career as an engraver and taught himself cuneiform from casts in the museum's collection, which makes his identification of these tablets something slightly unusual in the history of scholarship. A significant discovery made not by a formally trained academic, but by someone who had simply spent enough years in close proximity to the material that its patterns became legible to him. When he presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December 1872, the room was by most accounts completely unprepared for what he had found. The attention at the time focused primarily on Smith's identification of a flood narrative within the tablets, a story structurally close enough to the Genesis account that its implications unsettled Victorian religious assumptions about the uniqueness of Hebrew scripture. That controversy briefly dominated the conversation, but the quieter and more consequential discovery was something different. The Enuma Elish did not begin with the Anunnaki. It did not begin with Anu or Enlil or Enki, the gods whose names appear in temple dedications and royal inscriptions across thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. It began before those gods existed in a period the text describes as prior to naming itself, prior to the separation of one thing from another, prior to any distinction between above and below, between salt water and fresh, between the cosmos and the darkness that preceded it. The scribes who copied the Enuma Elish onto Ashurbanipal's tablets were working from earlier sources, some dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, which themselves drew from Sumerian traditions already ancient by that point. The text was layered across time before it was layered in the ground. What Smith was reading in 1872 was not the original composition, but a copy of a copy of a copy, each iteration preserving the words carefully. Generation after generation of hands pressing the same signs into wet clay with the same deliberate pressure, because the scribes who undertook this work believed they were handling something that could not be allowed to disappear. The physical act of cuneiform writing required a specific angle of stylus against clay, a particular rotation of the wrist at the end of each wedge mark. There was no shorthand, there was no faster method. Every sign was made by hand, one at a time, in material that would harden as it dried and become permanent. Why that level of institutional commitment to a single text? Part of the answer is political. The Enuma Elish elevated Marduk, Babylon's patron god, to supreme cosmic authority, and preserving it served Babylonian theological interests. But Ashurbanipal was Assyrian, not Babylonian. His patron deity was Ashur. He had no obvious political incentive to maintain Marduk's supremacy narrative so carefully in his personal archive. He preserved it because it was old, because it reached further back into divine history than most texts attempted, because it traced a genealogy of powers that the familiar gods of the active pantheon had not created and could not fully account for. The library at Nineveh collected knowledge the way a particular kind of mind gathers it, not for immediate use, but from a conviction that what is not held will be irretrievably lost, and that the loss of ancient knowledge is a form of damage that compounds silently across centuries. In this conviction, Ashurbanipal's librarians were correct. Of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that once filled temple archives across ancient Mesopotamia, scholars conservatively estimate that roughly 5% survive in any form. Not 5% of the canonical texts, 5% of everything. What remains represents a narrow corridor through a record that was in its full form, vastly larger and more internally varied than any reconstruction can convey. The creation traditions we are following tonight are therefore not the story. They are a trace through what the fire left behind, which is itself, depending on how one looks at it already, something close to improbable. And what remains begins not with gods, but with water, with two waters to be precise, and the question of what moved when they first began to separate, before the gods had names. The genealogy the tablets preserve. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish were not written to be read solemnly. They were written to be recited, spoken aloud in temple ceremony in the specific acoustic environment of a mud brick sanctuary, where the walls absorbed sound and the air held the smell of cedar incense and lamp oil. The text opens with a grammatical construction in Akkadian that functions less like a declarative sentence and more like a held breath. Enuma Elish la nabu shamamu. When on high the heaven had not been named. Not before the heaven existed, before it had been named. The distinction to the priests who composed this text was not a minor one. The unnamed thing and the named thing were understood as genuinely different states of being, as if the act of naming were itself a form of creation, a separation of something defined from the undifferentiated mass of what had not yet been distinguished from everything else surrounding it. In that unnamed state, two presences existed. Tiamat, the salt sea, vast, dark, extending beyond any horizon of a Mesopotamian fisherman could reach. And Apsu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, the sweet underground reservoir, from which wells drew their water, from which the great rivers were ultimately fed. The text describes them as mingling their waters, flowing together, without boundary, without the separation that would eventually make geography possible. This was not chaos, it was in the Greek sense of formless disorder. It was in the Babylonian understanding a kind of primordial fullness, two complementary principles in undivided union prior to the differentiation that all subsequent existence would require. The scribes who recorded this image were, among other things, describing something they could observe in the physical world around them. The mixing zones of the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates dispersed into the salt water of the open sea, produced exactly this phenomenon, a turbid, brackish region where freshened salt combined in one that was neither fully one thing nor the other. The cosmic principle was legible in the landscape. The landscape confirmed the principle. From this mingling, the first differentiation emerged. The Enuma Elish names it with precision Lahmu and Lahamu, a pair, whose names derive from the Akkadian root suggesting. Sediment deposit the material that settles when turbulent water slows. They were not created by intention. They precipitated. The text's own logic implies a process closer to natural chemistry than to divine craft. The way particulate matter suspended in moving water will slowly descend when the current eases accumulating on the riverbed, in layers that, given sufficient time, become something approaching solid ground. Lamu and Lahmu were the universe's first attempt at form, still fluid, still indistinct at their edges, but no longer purely undifferentiated. Something had begun to separate from something else, and that separation, however incomplete, was irreversible. What followed was not rapid. The tablets offer no specific duration for the ages between each generation of primordial beings, and the deliberate absence of precise timekeeping in this section of the narrative may itself be meaningful, as if the scribes understood that the processes they were describing operated outside the measurable cycles of days and seasons that structured ordinary Mesopotamian time. Lamu and Lahamu eventually produced their own offspring, Anshar and Kishar, whose names carry a translational precision that rewards attention. Anshar, the whole sky, the complete circle of everything above. Kishar, the whole earth, the complete circle of everything below. Where their parents had represented the first separation of incipient form from formlessness, Anshar and Kishar embodied the fundamental vertical division of existence, the differentiation of up from down, heaven from earth, the realm of celestial movement from the realm of terrestrial weight. The horizon line visible from any elevated point in the flat Mesopotamian plain, that thin boundary where sky meets earth at the limit of sight, marked the place where these two divine principles touched and defined each other. Every morning and evening the horizon made the theology visible. From Anshar came Anu, whose name means simply sky or heaven, the first of the divine figures recognizable to most students of Mesopotamian religion. And from Anu came the generation that would eventually concern itself with human affairs, Enlil, lord of wind and command, Enki, lord of the freshwater depths, and the keeper of the Mi, those tablets of divine decree on which the operations of civilization were inscribed. And from this generation in turn came the broad assembly of divine beings that the Sumerian king lists and temple hymns address as the Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones whose names appear in prayers and legal oaths, and astronomical records across more than 3,000 years of continuous Mesopotamian textual history. They are by any measure among the most extensively documented divine figures in the ancient world. And they appear in this genealogy according to the texts themselves as fourth-generation descendants of the earliest inheritors of a cosmic order they did not construct, positioned within a structure assembled by forces that predated them by an interval the tablets decline to measure. This detail is not incidental. The scribes who preserved the divine genealogy could have begun the narrative with Anu, or with Enlil, or with any of the major figures of the active pantheon. They chose instead to trace backward through Anshar, and Kishar through Lamu, and Lahamu through Tiamat and Apsu to a moment before any of those names existed to a state of being the text can only describe by noting what had not yet happened. It suggests that the priests who composed and maintained this tradition understood their own gods as participants in a story larger than the story those gods told about themselves, and that this understanding was considered important enough to preserve at the beginning of the most significant cosmological text in the Babylonian canon. The Anunnaki were not the origin. They were what the origin eventually produced after several intermediate stages that the tablets treat with the same careful attention they give to the more familiar divine figures. What the genealogy does not explain, and what the oldest Sumerian sources approach from a different angle entirely, is why Tiamat and Apsu should be considered the beginning rather than another intermediate stage in a longer sequence. That question belongs to a different trace, one that moves not through the tablets of the Babylonian canon, but through earlier Sumerian material where a figure older than both of them waits in the silence before the text begins. The dragon who was first a mother. What are the tablets said before Babylon rewrote them? Tablet K.3473 in the British Museum's cuneiform collection is not one of the more visually impressive items in the archive. It is damaged at one corner, its surface darkened by the fire that preserved its text, requiring considerable scholarly reconstruction to read with confidence. But within its surviving lines appears a passage that most popular retellings of Mesopotamian mythology quietly omit, a passage in which Tiamat, the figure modern culture most readily associates with primordial chaos and draconic destruction, speaks in defense of her children. When Apsu approaches her with the proposal that they should destroy the younger gods whose noise and restless movement has made sleep impossible, Tiamat objects. The text records her response with a directness that carries across the translation. How could they destroy what they themselves had created? The question is not rhetorical. It is the reaction of a parent unwilling to treat offspring as problems to be eliminated for the sake of convenience. This is where the received image of Tiamat, the chaos dragon, the embodiment of formless destruction, the monster whose death makes the world possible, begins to show its seams. The figure preserved in the earliest recoverable layers of the Enuma Elish is not an adversary. She is a mother, and her initial response to the crisis that will eventually consume her is protective rather than predatory. The transformation from this figure to the one Marduk defeats in cosmic battle is not instantaneous, and the text, if read carefully rather than summarized, preserves the logic of that transformation with more internal coherence than the simplified version suggests. Tiamat becomes what she becomes because Apsu is murdered, slain by Ea, the wisest of the younger gods, through a spell of enchanted sleep before Apsu can carry out his own lethal plan. Grief in the Enuma. Elish is the mechanism of cosmic catastrophe. The Dragon Mother does not attack because she is evil. She attacks because her consort has been killed by her children, and the emotion the tablets ascribe to her in the aftermath is not rage, but something closer to the particular anguish of a loss that cannot be undone. The scholarly question, and it is a genuine one pursued seriously by historians of religion over several decades, is how much of this more complex portrait reflects the original Sumerian tradition, and how much reflects what happened to that tradition when Babylon rose to political dominance. The work of scholars including Thorkild Jacobsen and Stephanie Dallier has traced the ways in which Babylonian editors appear to have reshaped older material to serve new theological and political purposes. Marduk was not a figure of great antiquity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. He was the patron deity of Babylon, a city whose political supremacy over the older Sumerian centres was not established until the reign of Hammurabi around 1792 BCE. The Enuma Elish, in the form Ashurbanipal's scribes preserved, it reads in part like a theological justification for that political fact. The god of the currently dominant city is revealed to be the greatest of all cosmic powers, the one whose victory over primordial chaos made the ordered world possible. Every other god in the pantheon owes its position to his authority. Every older claim to supremacy is absorbed into a narrative that places Babylon's patron at the centre of creation itself. For that narrative to function, Tiamat needed to be a certain kind of figure. A grieving mother defending herself after provocation does not serve the same ideological purpose as a chaos monster, whose annihilation is the precondition for all order. The editorial pressure toward the latter image, if it existed, and most scholars who have examined the textual history believe it did, would have been substantial and purposeful. What is notable is how incompletely it succeeded. The earlier portrait survives in fragments precisely because the scribes who copied the text were in the main more committed to preserving what they had received than to producing a doctrinally consistent revision. The contradiction between Tiamat as mother and Tiamat as monster was apparently allowed to stand generation after generation in the same text, because the alternative selective omission deliberate rewriting was understood as a kind of damage to the record that the scribal tradition was not willing to inflict. Older still than the Babylonian Enuma Elish is a Sumerian figure whose relationship to Tiamat suggests what the tradition may have looked like before the political pressures of the Babylonian period reshaped it. Namu, the primordial sea addressed in Sumerian hymns from Nippur as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth, without consort appears in texts considerably earlier than the Babylonian material, and her character there is entirely generative. She does not threaten, she produces. She is the source from which the gods emerge, the way rivers emerge from underground springs not through conflict, but through the natural outward pressure of what is full. Scholars including Jacobson have argued that Namu represents an earlier stratum of the same cosmic sea concept that the Babylonian tradition eventually divided into the opposing figures of Tiamat and Apsu, introducing the element of conflict that the older undivided figure did not require. If that argument holds, then the Tiamat of the Enuma Elish is not the original conception, but a revision of one, a figure who has been split from an earlier wholeness and partially recast as adversary to serve a story that required a villain. The detail worth holding is this: every ancient tradition that has looked at the primordial sea Namu, Tiamat, the Hebrew Tihom, the Greek. Chaos has understood it as the source of everything, including the gods. None of them have been entirely comfortable making it purely destructive, because making it purely destructive would mean that everything which exists emerged from something that should not have survived. The scribes who preserved Tiamat's defense of her children were not making a theological error. They were preserving a memory of what the primordial sea was before the politics of a particular century required it to become something else. And beneath that memory, older still, the question of what produced the primordial sea itself continues to move, patient unanswered, in the direction of the next trace. The sky inside the stitch, when the genealogy of gods may be a map of heaven. A full processional steel, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that gradually shifts the position of every star in the night sky relative to the horizon, takes approximately 25,920 years to complete. The Babylonian astronomers who worked from the observation platforms at the top of the ziggurat at Babylon, a structure called a temenanki, meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth, could not have measured a complete cycle within a single lifetime, or within a dynasty, or within the entire recorded span of Mesopotamian civilization. Yet the mathematical tablets recovered from the Seleucid period, dating to around 300 BCE, demonstrate that Babylonian astronomers were tracking precessional drift with a precision that required data accumulated across centuries of continuous observation data that could only exist if the institution of astronomical record-keeping had been maintained without interruption through political upheavals, foreign conquests, and the rise and fall of multiple empires. Someone across a very long time had been watching and writing everything down. This is the trace that complicates the others, and it is worth being explicit about why. The first trace established the divine genealogy as a sophisticated theological construction older than the familiar Anunnaki and reaching back through successive primordial generations toward an uncreated source. The second trace followed the political reshaping of Tiamat's character across Babylonian editorial history. Both of those traces treat the Enuma Elish primarily as a text about gods, about divine persons, divine relationships, and the theological arguments that Babylonian priests embedded in cosmological narrative. This third trace asks a different question. What if portions of the same text are also simultaneously a record of something observed in the sky? What if the genealogy of primordial beings is not only theology, but also in some encoded layer that modern scholarship has not fully mapped a description of celestial phenomena, that the ziggurat astronomers tracked across generations and chose to preserve in mythological rather than purely mathematical form? The proposal is not new, and it has been advanced in varying forms by scholars working across the fields of archaeoastronomy, comparative mythology, and the history of science. The most discussed version concerns Tiamat herself. The Milky Way visible from any point on Earth, far enough from artificial light, appears as an elongated band of diffuse luminosity stretching across the full arc of the night sky, a structure that ancient observers in the flat open terrain of Mesopotamia would have seen with a clarity and regularity that most modern eyes have never experienced. Its shape is serpentine, in the broader sense elongated, irregular at the edges, dividing the visible celestial sphere into two roughly equal hemispheres. The Enuma Elish describes Tiamat's body after Marduk's defeat as being divided to form the vault of heaven above and the earth below, her upper half becoming sky, her lower half becoming ground. Her eyes releasing the Tigris and Euphrates If Tiamat's body and defeat maps onto the Milky Way in the sky, then the cosmic battle is not only a theological event, but a description of the galaxy's relationship to the horizon, and Marduk's victory is a kind of astronomical notation preserved in narrative form. The 11 monsters Tiamat creates before the final battle have attracted similar attention. The list preserved in tablet K.3437, the Viper, the Dragon, the Sphinx, the Great Lion, the Mad Dog, the Scorpion Man, and several others, has been tentatively identified by some researchers as corresponding to zodiacal constellations, the band of stellar figures through which the sun, moon, and planets appear to move across the course of a year. The identification is contested, and mainstream scholarship treats it as speculative rather than established. The correspondence between the monster list and specific constellations is inexact enough that it could reflect genuine astronomical encoding, or it could reflect the simple fact that ancient cultures tended to populate both the sky and their mythologies with the same repertoire of powerful animals and hybrid creatures. Coincidence of imagery is not the same as intentional mapping. The honest position is that the question remains genuinely difficult to resolve. From the surviving evidence, which is itself already a meaningful observation, it means the astronomical layer, if it exists, was not obvious enough to be unambiguous, which raises its own set of questions about why it would be encoded obliquely rather than directly. Apsu presents a third possibility. So the dark regions between stellar groupings, the areas of the night sky where the density of visible stars drops, and the background darkness becomes perceptible as a presence rather than merely an absence, were observed by Mesopotamian astronomers as carefully as the bright stars themselves. Several cosmological traditions around the world have associated these dark sky regions with primordial water, with the cosmic ocean beneath and around the ordered world. If Apsu, the freshwater abyss, maps onto the dark spaces between stars, rather than onto any terrestrial body of water, then the primordial mingling of Tiamat and Apsu describes something visible on any clear night, the luminous band of the Milky Way, distributed through and against a surrounding darkness, salt-bright structure and freshwater void intertwined across the whole of the visible sky. What makes this trace genuinely complicating rather than simply additive is what it implies about the priests who composed and preserved this material. The same institutions that maintained the Enuma Elish also produced the mathematical astronomy tablets, the eclipse prediction records, the planetary position logs, the calculation schemes for lunar cycles. These were not separate communities of specialists. They were, by the best available evidence, the same community temple scholars who understood cosmological myth and quantitative astronomy as two modes of engaging with the same subject. If that is true, then the assumption that the Enuma Elish is purely theological and the astronomical tablets are purely scientific may itself be an imposition of modern categorical thinking onto a tradition that did not make that distinction. The priests may have intended both to be read simultaneously, each illuminating the other, the narrative giving meaning to the numbers, and the numbers giving precision to the narrative. That possibility does not confirm the astronomical readings, but it does suggest that dismissing them entirely requires a confidence about ancient intentions that the surviving record does not actually support. The question of what the priests knew, and what they chose to encode and why opens into the next layer, where three traces now laid against each other begin to suggest a shape that none of them could produce alone. 3. Traces one shape, what emerges? When the lines are laid together, it is a reasonable skeptical position to hold each of the preceding traces separately, to grant the genealogy its theological complexity, to acknowledge the political reshaping of Tiamat's character, to consider the astronomical layer as an interesting but unverified hypothesis, and to conclude that three interesting observations do not necessarily constitute a single coherent argument. That position deserves respect. It is in many ways the more disciplined one. But there is a different kind of attention available to us at this point in the narrative, not the attention that evaluates each trace in isolation looking for individual proof, but the attention that steps back and notices the shape that the three traces make when they are placed beside each other without forcing them into contact. What follows is not a claim that the shape proves anything. It is an observation about what the shape looks like, offered slowly without urgency, in the way that a person standing at a sufficient distance from three separate hills might notice for the first time that they form a continuous ridge. The first trace established something about sequence and inheritance. The divine genealogy preserved in the Enuma Elish does not begin with the gods the Mesopotamians worshipped in their temples and named in their oaths. It begins several generations earlier with primordial principles, Tiamat and Apsu, then Lamu and Lahom, then Anshar and Kishar. Each pair representing a further stage of cosmic differentiation, a further separation of one thing from another, before the familiar divine figures of the active pantheon appear at all. The Anunnaki, by the logic of the texts themselves, are late arrivals in a cosmos that was already ancient before their generation came into being. This is not a minor narrative detail. This is the explicit claim of the most carefully preserved cosmological text in the Babylonian canon, copied and maintained across more than 1,000 years of institutional effort. The scribes who preserved it were not preserving a creation story that began with gods. They were preserving a creation story that began before gods, and that treated the gods as the outcome of a process, rather than the initiators of one. The second trace added a layer of historical depth to that genealogy, by showing that the figures within it had not always been what the Babylonian version made them. Tiamat's original character, Generative, protective the source rather than the enemy, and her probable relationship to the older Sumerian figure of Namu suggest that the divine genealogy was itself subject to revision across time, that the story of origins had a history of being retold in ways that served the political and theological needs of whoever held institutional authority at any given moment. This means the genealogy is not simply a record of what the Mesopotamians believed about cosmic origins. It is a record of what they believed filtered through successive layers of editorial intention, some of which moved the material in one direction, and some of which moved it in another, none of which were entirely successful at erasing what they revised. The older portrait survives in fragments precisely because the scribal tradition was more committed to preservation than to consistency. The third trace then proposed that the same material, the same figures, the same cosmic battle, the same division of Tiamat's body into heaven and earth, may carry an additional register of meaning that operates alongside the theological one, rather than replacing it an astronomical layer in which the genealogy of primordial beings maps at least partially onto observable celestial phenomena that the ziggurat astronomers tracked across centuries of careful record-keeping. The Milky Way as Tiamat's elongated form, the dark sky regions as Apsu's freshwater void, the 11 monsters as zodiacal figures, each correspondence is individually contestable. But the context in which it arises a scholarly community that produced both cosmological mythology and sophisticated mathematical astronomy within the same institutional framework without apparently distinguishing between them, as separate disciplines makes the possibility that these registers were intentionally layered harder to dismiss than it might initially appear. Now consider what the three traces shares. Each of them points from a different angle toward the same structural observation that the tradition the Babylonian scribes preserved was older and more layered than its surface presentation suggests, that the figures within it carried meanings that exceeded any single interpretive frame, and that the most significant of those figures, Tiamat, Apsu, Namu, the primordial waters from which everything emerged, were understood by the people who preserved them as representing something that preceded the gods, preceded the cosmos, and preceded the possibility of naming. The theological trace reaches this conclusion through genealogy. The historical trace reaches it through the evidence of editorial revision, which implies an original that the revision was working against. The astronomical trace reaches it through the alignment between cosmological narrative and celestial observation, which implies a community of thinkers whose understanding of the sky informed their understanding of how everything began. Three different methods of inquiry converging on a single territory is not proof of anything, but it is a pattern worth noting with some care. What gives the convergence its particular texture, its quality of something almost forming rather than fully formed, is the specific nature of what all three traces are pointing toward. They are not pointing toward a historical event, a discoverable artifact, or a verifiable claim about the physical world. They are pointing toward a question: what did the people who built these traditions actually understand about the origins of existence, and how much of that understanding survives in the texts they left behind? The answer the traces collectively suggest is that the understanding was more sophisticated, more internally complex, and more aware of its own limitations than the simplified versions that circulate in popular culture. The priests who composed the Enuma Elish knew the story was old. They knew it was layered. They preserved the contradictions it contained, rather than resolving them, because they appear to have understood that the contradictions were not errors, but features, signs that the subject matter was genuinely resistant to the kind of clean resolution that simpler narratives could achieve. 3 traces, 1 shape, not a proof, not a conclusion, a topology, a description of the terrain as it appears from a sufficient distance before the ground is reached, and the individual features start to obscure the larger form. The shape will be tested in the next chapter, where the most serious objections to everything that has been observed are given their full weight, not to dismiss the pattern, but to determine how much of it survives contact with the most rigorous counter-argument available. What the careful objection says and what it leaves untouched. The most disciplined version of the counter-argument does not begin with dismissal. It begins with a question about method, about what kind of evidence is required before a pattern of the sort traced in the preceding chapters can be considered meaningful rather than merely interesting. This is a reasonable place to start, and this is the scholars who have made it most forcefully deserve to be heard, without the softening that comes from treating their objections as obstacles to be navigated, rather than positions that carry genuine intellectual weight. The mainstream academic view of Mesopotamian cosmology, as articulated by scholars including John Botero, Thorkild Jacobson and Stephanie Dalley, across decades of careful philological work, holds that the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian creation traditions surrounding it are precisely what they appear to be: sophisticated theological philosophy, produced by highly intelligent minds working within their cultural frameworks to address questions about the nature of existence, the origins of order, and the relationship between human society and the powers that govern it. This reading does not diminish the texts. It locates them accurately within the intellectual tradition they belong to, and it resists the impulse to find hidden layers of meaning, where the surface meaning is already rich enough to reward serious attention. The first substantial objection concerns the genealogy itself. The divine generations traced through the Enuma Elish, Tiamat and Apsu Lamu and Lahamu Anshar and Kishar, and finally Anu and his descendants, can be read in this view as a cosmological allegory rather than a literal record of pre-divine history. The progression from undifferentiated primordial waters to increasingly specific cosmic principles mirrors the observable process by which order emerges from disorder in the natural world, sediment settling from turbid water, the horizon line becoming distinct as light separates sky from earth. At dawn, the differentiation of wind and weather from the general atmospheric conditions that precede them. The Babylonian priests were not describing actual persons or entities in the genealogy. They were encoding in the only narrative form available to them an understanding of how structured existence arises from unstructured potential, which is a genuinely sophisticated philosophical observation, and one that does not require the existence of primordial beings to be intellectually serious. The genealogy is meaningful as philosophy, without needing to be meaningful as history, and treating it as something more than philosophical allegory may say more about the interpreter's appetite for mystery than about the intentions of the scribes who composed it. This objection has considerable force, and it is not one that the pattern traced across the previous chapters can simply absorb without acknowledging the pressure. The scribes who copied the Enuma Elish were operating within a tradition of theological reflection that was explicitly analogical, a tradition in which natural phenomena were regularly understood through the lens of divine persons and divine relationships, and in which the boundary between metaphor and literal description was drawn differently than modern readers tend to assume. Lam and Lahamu as sediment, Anshar and Kishar as horizon. These are not strained allegorical readings imposed from outside. They are readings the ancient vocabulary actively supports. The objection is fair. What it leaves less fully addressed is why the tradition went to the specific trouble of tracing the genealogy backward through 4 generations before reaching the familiar gods, rather than beginning, as many other ancient cosmologies do, with the divine figures who actually perform the work of creation. The philosophical point about order emerging from chaos could have been made without the detailed genealogy. The genealogy was added or preserved for reasons the allegory reading does not fully account for. The second objection targets the astronomical layer directly. The identification of Tiamat with the Milky Way Apsu, with the dark sky regions, and the 11 monsters with the zodiacal constellations belongs in mainstream scholarship's assessment to the category of speculative archaeoastronomy, a field with genuine methodological achievements, but also a well-documented tendency to find celestial correspondences in ancient texts that may reflect pattern seeking by modern researchers rather than encoding by ancient ones. The human visual system is highly effective at finding shapes in ambiguous data. The same cognitive capacity that allowed Mesopotamian astronomers to identify constellations in arrangements of stars also allows modern scholars to identify astronomical symbolism in arrangements of mythological figures, and the two processes are not equally reliable. Without an explicit ancient source confirming that a specific mythological figure was intended as a representation of a specific celestial phenomenon, the correspondence remains a hypothesis rather than a finding. The precision required to move from interesting parallel to established interpretation has not been met for most of the astronomical readings proposed for the Enuma Elish. Again, the objection is well-founded. The astronomical correspondences are individually contestable, and the honest position, as noted in the previous chapter, is that the evidence does not resolve the question in either direction with the confidence that would be needed for a firm conclusion. What the objection does not address is the institutional context. The fact that the same community produced both cosmological mythology and mathematical astronomy within the same physical buildings and the same professional lineage without the disciplinary separation that modern categories impose. The absence of explicit confirmation that Tiamat was intended as the Milky Way is a genuine gap. But the absence of explicit confirmation also reflects the nature of a tradition in which certain kinds of knowledge may have been considered too fundamental or too closely held to require annotation. The observation that 3 independent traces point toward the same general territory, the idea that the primordial layer of Mesopotamian cosmology preserves something more complex and more aware of its own limitations than the surface presentation suggests, may itself reflect a form of selection bias. The traces were chosen after all from a much larger field of possible observations about the same material. A different selection might have produced a different convergence or no convergence at all. The shape that emerges when the 3 traces are placed beside each other is partly a function of which 3 traces were chosen, and that choice was not made by the ancient scribes. The pattern after contact with these objections is neither confirmed nor dissolved. It is what it was before a set of observations that a careful thinker might find worth holding, not as proof of anything but as a description of terrain that the objections illuminate from certain angles without fully mapping. The next question is what survives when the objections are taken seriously, and the traces are followed further into material the counterarguments have not yet reached. What travels further than the empire that carried it? A word sometimes survives longer than the civilization that first gave it meaning. In the opening verses of Genesis in the Hebrew text that Jewish scribes copied with the same generational care that Babylonian scribes applied to the Enuma Elish, there is a word that most readers pass over without pausing. The verse describes the moment before creation as a darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Hebrew word translated as the deep is tehom. It appears without a definite article in the original text, which is grammatically unusual for Hebrew nouns. Most Hebrew nouns require the article when used in a definite sense. Tehom appears without it as if it were a proper name or as if it referred to something so foundational that the article was unnecessary, the way one does not say the existence but simply existence. Linguists tracing the phonetic evolution of Semitic languages have documented the descent of Tehom directly from Tiamat through a sequence of well-attested sound shifts. The correspondence is not speculative. It is the kind of finding that appears in reference grammars and philological dictionaries cited without controversy as an established etymological fact. This is the kind of evidence the skeptic chapter did not reach, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment. The objections raised in the previous chapter were methodological. They addressed the reliability of allegorical readings as the standards required for archaeoastronomical interpretation, and the selection bias that may operate when independent traces are brought into convergence. All of those objections remain valid on their own terms, but the linguistic survival of Tiamat's name in the Hebrew creation narrative is not a matter of interpretation or convergence. It's documented transmission evidence that the concept of the primordial deep, understood as a named entity prior to the ordered world, travelled from Mesopotamian theological tradition into the textual foundation of a religious culture that would eventually shape the entire subsequent history of Western thought. The Babylonian creation narrative did not stay in Babylon. It moved, carried by trade and conquest and deportation and cultural exchange, into traditions that inherited its core intuition about origins, even when they transformed its specific content beyond recognition. The mechanism of that transmission is partially recoverable. The Babylonian exile, the period beginning around 597 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar II deported significant portions of the Judean population to Babylon, placed Hebrew scribes in direct contact with Babylonian literary and theological culture for several generations. The Enuma Elish was not a private document. It was recited publicly during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration, in ceremonies that were civic as well as religious events. Hebrew exiles living in Babylon would have had exposure to its content even without access to the cuneiform tablets themselves. What they encountered there, a cosmology in which the primordial waters preceded creation, in which the divine act of ordering the world worked upon and against a pre-existing deep-left traces in the Hebrew texts that their scribes were composing and editing during this same period. The traces are not wholesale borrowings, they are something more subtle. The persistence of a conceptual shape, the idea of teham through a cultural transmission that altered the story while retaining the structural intuition behind it. The Book of Psalms and the Book of Isaiah preserve this older layer even more explicitly than Genesis does. Both texts contain passages in which the god of Hebrew theology defeats a sea monster called Rahab or Leviathan in terms that structurally mirror Marduk's battle with Tiamat. These passages do not fit comfortably within the theological framework of Genesis, where creation proceeds by divine speech alone without combat or opposition. They survive in the Hebrew canon as fragments of a different telling, one in which the primordial deep was not merely present before creation, but was in some sense resistant to it, requiring defeat rather than simply transformation. Scholars refer to this as the combat myth, and its presence in Hebrew scripture is not the product of later contamination, but evidence of the depth to which Mesopotamian cosmological thinking had penetrated traditions that were in other respects quite deliberately differentiating themselves from their Babylonian inheritance. The same structural shape appears transformed further in the Neoplatonic philosophical tradition of the 3rd century CE. Plotinus, writing in Alexandria, in a cultural environment saturated with Hellenistic, Egyptian and Near Eastern intellectual traditions, proposed a cosmology of emanation, in which ultimate reality called the One generates a succession of lower principles through a process that requires no conflict and no material substrate, only the natural overflow of what is full. The One generates Nu's divine mind, Nu generates soul, soul generates the material world. Each level of the emanation is less perfect than the one above it, further from the undivided source, more differentiated, more subject to the conditions of time and space. The structural parallel to the Mesopotamian divine genealogy, primordial unity differentiating through successive generations in the specific figures who operate the ordered cosmos, does not require direct borrowing to be significant. It may reflect the independent operation of the same fundamental intuition that the source of everything must be something that precedes distinction, that the genealogy of existence moves from undivided wholeness toward increasing specificity, and that the figures we can name are always downstream from something that resists naming. The transmission evidence does not validate the specific claims of the Enuma Elish about the nature of Tiamat or the age of the divine genealogy. What it does is something different and arguably more significant for the purposes of this inquiry. It demonstrates that the core intuition preserved in the Mesopotamian cosmological tradition was compelling enough and portable enough to survive the collapse of the civilization that first articulated it in literary form. Ideas that travel this far, this persistently through this many independent cultural transformations are not simply serving the political interests of any one empire. They are addressing something that human minds return to independently across languages and centuries and theological frameworks that share no institutional connection. The question that survives all the objections is not whether the Enuma Elish is literally true in its specific claims. It is why the shape of what it describes origins in undifferentiated depth gods as inheritors rather than creators The primordial source is something that precedes naming, keeps appearing in recognizably similar form wherever ancient cultures turned their attention to the question of what existed before everything else. That recurrence is the next trace, and it runs deeper than any single tradition can contain. What the gods required divine dependency, and the question it opens. The Igigi burned their tools 40 years into their labour, or so the Atrahasis epic records. The detail is precise in a way that rewards attention. Not a spontaneous uprising, not a sudden breaking point, but a calculated act by beings who had apparently been calculating for some time. They gathered their spades and their baskets, the instruments of the canal digging and irrigation work that had occupied them since before human civilization existed, and set them alight in front of Enlil's dwelling at midnight. Then they surrounded the house and refused to leave. The great god of wind and command, whose authority extended across the ordered world, found himself besieged by his own workforce, unable to sleep, unable to negotiate, left with no immediately available solution to a labour crisis that threatened the physical maintenance of the cosmos. The scene, if read without the expectation that divine figures should behave with omnipotent self-sufficiency, has the texture of a management dispute, which is arguably exactly what the Babylonian scribes who composed it intended it to be. The Atrahasis epic preserved on tablets dating to approximately 1700 BC. Though drawing on earlier Sumerian sources, is primarily known in popular culture as a flood narrative, one of the several Mesopotamian versions of the great inundation that the Hebrew tradition would eventually inherit and transform. But the flood occupies only the final third of the text. The preceding two-thirds are concerned with something different, the reason humanity was created at all. And that reason, as the Atrahasis tablets state with a directness that leaves little room for allegory, was that the gods needed workers and had run out of a willing workforce among their own number. Enki, presented throughout the text as the pragmatic problem solver of the divine assembly, proposes the solution fashion, a new class of being from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. A being capable of labour, capable of reproduction, capable of maintaining the physical infrastructure that the cosmos apparently required. Humanity was created not from divine abundance, not from a desire to share existence, but from institutional necessity. The universe needed maintenance, and the gods preferred not to provide it themselves. This is the detail that the other traces have circled without addressing directly, and it changes the shape of the question considerably. The divine genealogy traced in the Enuma Elish presents the Anunnaki as inheritors of a cosmos assembled by more primordial powers. They did not build the structure they occupy, they received it. The Atrahasis material adds a further layer to that inherited dependency. Not only did the Anunnaki not create the foundations of their cosmos, they could not maintain its surface operations without external assistance. The great gods of the Babylonian pantheon, the beings who appear in royal inscriptions as the supreme authorities of heaven and earth, whose favour determined the success of Vavashiet and Maine, and military campaigns, and the legitimacy of kings were by the logic of their own creation, narratives operating within a system of constraints and dependencies that their theological presentation elsewhere did not always foreground. The Sumerian concept of the me illuminates this from a different angle. The me, a term that resists clean translation but is generally rendered as divine decrees, or the fundamental principles of civilization, were understood in Sumerian theology as a set of tablets on which the operational rules of the ordered world were inscribed: kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, the crafts, the arts, justice, music, the scribal craft, and dozens of other functions that together constituted what the Mesopotamians understood as civilized existence. The Mei were not invented by the Anunnaki. They were possessed by them, kept in the Apsu, the freshwater depths beneath Enki's temple at Eridu, and guarded with considerable care precisely because their loss would mean the unravelling of the ordered world. The Descent of Inanna narrative, in which the goddess acquires the me from Enki through a combination of strategic drinking and divine bargaining, treats their transfer as a crisis of cosmic proportions. They were that fundamental and that vulnerable. What the concept of the me implies when held alongside the Atrahasis material is a picture of divine authority that differs substantially from the omnipotent sovereignty that later monotheistic traditions would associate with the divine. The Anunnaki did not create the principles of civilization, they administered them. They did not sustain the physical operations of the cosmos through inherent power. They depended on human labour to perform that maintenance. And they did not create the primordial framework within which their own existence was possible. They inherited it fully assembled from generations of cosmic differentiation that preceded them by an interval the texts decline to measure. The portrait is not of gods who stand outside and above the system of existence controlling it through autonomous will. It's of gods who are deeply embedded within a system larger than themselves, subject to its constraints, dependent on its continued functioning, and crucially aware, at least in the more reflective passages of the tradition, of how much they themselves do not control or fully understand the divine assembly. The Purim that Council of Gods described in Nippur tablets dating to around 2100 BCE, where cosmic decisions were reached through deliberation rather than decree, reinforces this reading. A deity who required consensus from a council to make binding decisions was not operating from a position of unconstrained omnipotence. The assembly structure implies that even divine authority was distributed, that the individual powers of even the greatest gods were bounded by the collective authority of the whole, and that this arrangement was understood as a feature of cosmic governance rather than a limitation to be overcome. The universe in this theology was not run by a single will. It was managed collaboratively by a community of beings who were themselves embedded within and dependent upon structures they had not designed. The question this opens, and it is one the previous traces do not fully prepare, is whether the dependency runs further than the atrahasis and the Purim material alone suggests. If the Anunnaki required human labour, and if the primordial figures they descended from required the process of cosmic differentiation to produce them, and if even Namu, the uncreated sea, is described in the oldest Sumerian hymns simply as the ground of everything without any account of her own origin, then the chain of dependency extends backward without a terminus. Not a genealogy that reaches a first cause, a genealogy that reaches instead a point where the question of cause stops being answerable, and the tradition without embarrassment simply stops asking it. That stopping point is not an admission of failure. It may be the most sophisticated theological observation in the entire corpus, and it opens quietly into the territory that the final traces are designed to explore. The hymn that ends with a question. A pattern, without a source. Rigveda. 10.129 is 11 verses long. Composed in Sanskrit, preserved within the oldest surviving stratum of the Vedic textual tradition, and dated by most scholars to somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE, it is known in Sanskrit as the Nasadiya Sukta, the hymn of non-existence, or more literally the hymn of not the non-existent. The title points immediately at the philosophical difficulty the hymn is attempting to address. The state it describes is not non-existence in the simple sense, because non-existence would itself be a kind of defined condition, and the hymn is trying to describe what preceded all defined conditions, including the distinction between existing and not existing. The opening lines establish the problem with a compression that resists easy paraphrase. There was neither being nor non-being then. There was no air, no sky beyond it. What covered everything? Under whose protection was there water, unfathomable deep? The questions accumulate without answering each other. The cosmos before it was a cosmos was something the language of existence and non-existence cannot contain. The structural parallel to the opening of the Enuma Elish is not a matter of vague thematic similarity. It is specific enough to require attention. Both texts describe a primordial state characterized by the absence of named things in the Babylonian text. Heaven and earth have not yet been named. In the Vedic text, existence and non-existence do not yet apply as categories. Both associate that primordial state with depth and with water, the Enuma Elish, with the mingling of Tiamat and Apsu, the Nasadiya Sukta with water unfathomable and deep. Both treat the first movement toward differentiation as the beginning of a process, rather than an instantaneous creation. And both significantly arrive at a point where the available conceptual vocabulary fails, where the text itself pauses and acknowledges that the question it is asking exceeds what the tradition can answer. The Enuma Elish handles this by tracing back to Namu and stopping there without explanation. The Nasadiya Sukta handles it by ending its final verse with a direct question addressed to the gods. Do they know when this came into being? They were born after. Perhaps even they do not know. The issue that makes this parallel the most demanding detail in the entire inquiry is geographical and historical. The Vedic tradition developed in the Indian subcontinent in a cultural and linguistic lineage that diverged from the Mesopotamian tradition somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE, before either tradition had produced the text we are comparing. By the time the Nasadiya Sukta was composed, Mesopotamia and the Vedic world were not in the kind of sustained cultural contact that would allow the transmission of specific philosophical frameworks from one to the other. The shared Proto-Indo-European ancestry of certain linguistic elements does not account for the convergence because the Enuma Elish is a Semitic text with no Proto-Indo-European linguistic substrate. The two traditions are not branches of the same family. They arrived at structurally similar descriptions of the pre-cosmic state through independent roots from different linguistic and cultural foundations, and the descriptions they produced are similar not in surface imagery alone, but in their philosophical structure, in what they claim about the nature of what preceded existence, in how they locate the limits of divine knowledge, and in their shared decision to end the inquiry at precisely the point where it cannot be continued. Ancient Egypt adds a third instance that the transmission hypothesis cannot absorb. The Hermopolitan cosmogony, the creation tradition centered on the city of Kemenu, known to the Greeks as Hermopolis, described the state before creation through a group of 8 primordial deities called the Ogdoad, arranged in 4 male-female pairs. The names of the pairs are Nun and Naunet, the primordial waters, Hur and Hauhet, formlessness or boundlessness, Kuk and Kauket, darkness, and Amun and Amaunet, the hidden or invisible. Each pair represents a quality of the pre-cosmic state, the conditions that obtained before the ordered world emerged. What the Hermopolitan tradition shares with both the Mesopotamian and Vedic material is not a specific mythology, but a philosophical topology. The state before creation is characterized by depth, by boundlessness, by darkness, and by a quality of hiddenness or invisibility that the tradition associates with something present but unperceivable. The pre-cosmic state is not empty. It is full in a way that resists the categories through which fullness and emptiness are normally distinguished. 3 traditions, 3 independent developments, 3 structurally convergent descriptions of what preceded the gods and preceded the cosmos, each one arriving from a different linguistic and cultural starting point at a primordial depth that is associated with water, characterized by the absence of the distinctions that make naming possible, and located beyond the reach of even divine knowledge. The Mesopotamian tradition stops at Namu and declines to explain her. The Vedic tradition asks the gods if they know, and notes that they were born after. The Egyptian tradition names the qualities of the pre-cosmic state, but does not account for why those qualities existed or what produced them. All 3 reach the same boundary and fall silent at it, each in its own language, each apparently without knowledge of how the others fell silent. The most rigorous position available here is that convergent intuitions about origins arise independently, because the problem of origins is universal, and that minds confronting the same fundamental question, what existed before existence, will tend to produce structurally similar answers, because the logical constraints on any answer to that question are the same, regardless of cultural context. That is a defensible position, and it explains a significant portion of the convergence. What it does not fully account for is the specificity of the parallel, not merely that all 3 traditions posit a pre-cosmic depth, but that all 3 locate the limit of divine knowledge at precisely that depth, and all 3 treat that limit not as a failure of the tradition, but as an honest acknowledgement of what the tradition can and cannot reach. That particular intellectual move, the decision to preserve the question at the boundary rather than fill it with a constructed answer, is not logically compelled by the problem of origins. It is a choice. And the fact that 3 independent traditions made the same choice about the same boundary suggests something about what the people who made those choices understood, each in their own way, about the nature of what they were approaching. Not proof, a pattern, one that reaches further than any single tradition can explain, and further than the objections of the previous chapter can dissolve. The remaining traces do not press deeper into this territory. They do something different and they step back until the whole landscape becomes visible from a sufficient distance, that individual details stop competing for attention and the overall shape quietly comes into view. The landscape from a distance. What the whole shape suggests. What does it mean to know something about origins that cannot be verified? The question is not rhetorical and it is not uniquely modern. The Babylonian scribes who copied the Enuma Elish generation after generation were themselves several thousand years downstream from whatever experiences or observations or transmitted oral traditions first gave rise to the material they were preserving. They could not verify the genealogy of primordial beings any more than we can. They could not confirm that Tiamat and Apsu had existed as the texts describe them, or that Lama and Lahamu had precipitated from their mingling in the way that sediment precipitates from turbulent water. What they possessed was a tradition, a structured account of origins that had been considered worth preserving across a span of time so long that the original reasons for preserving it had themselves become part of the tradition, rather than recoverable historical facts. They copied because it had been copied before them, and because whatever the material meant the institution they belonged to had decided across generations of deliberate choice that its loss would be a damage not worth risking. Across the entire body of material examined in this inquiry, from the 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish, to the Nippur Divine Assembly records, to the Atrahasis Labour narrative, to the Vedic Nasadiya Sukta, to the Egyptian Hermopolitan Ogdoad, the traditions that dealt most seriously with the speculative of origins, shared a consistent intellectual posture that distinguished them from traditions that gave simpler answers. That posture involved first a willingness to trace the genealogy of existence backward, further than immediate theological convenience required, further than the familiar gods, further than the primordial pairs, all this way to a boundary where the available concepts stopped applying. Second, a willingness to acknowledge that boundary honestly rather than filling it with an improvised answer. And third, a decision to preserve the question at that boundary rather than resolving it, treating the unresolvable limit of the tradition not as an embarrassment, but as a feature, as the most intellectually honest thing the tradition could offer. The Tablet of Destinies, which appears in the Enuma Elish as the object Tiamat places on Kingu's chest to confer supreme authority over cosmic fate, is a detail that the preceding traces have not fully examined, and it illuminates the posture from an unexpected angle. The Sumerian tablets of divine decree that govern the operations of civilization, and the Tablet of Destinies are related but distinct concepts. The were operational. They contained the specific functions and principles of ordered existence, and their possession conferred the ability to administer those functions. The Tablet of Destinies was something different, not a collection of operational principles, but a single locus of ultimate authority over fate itself, the object whose possession determined who held final say over the direction of the cosmos. Its significance in the narrative is that it could be transferred. Tiamat gives it to Kingu. Marduk takes it from Kingu after defeating Tiamat. The supreme authority over cosmic fate is not inherent in any particular divine being. It is an object external to the gods that they compete to possess. The cosmology that produced this concept was not describing a universe controlled by divine will from within. It was describing a universe in which even their divine authority was mediated by an external principle, a tablet, a decree, a structural feature of existence that the gods could hold but not create, and could lose as well as gain. This is the landscape the full inquiry has been tracing without quite naming it directly until now. The Anunnaki did not create the cosmos, they inherited it. They did not create the principles that governed it. Those were inscribed on the me and held in the Absu prior to their own intervention. They did not sustain its operations independently. They required human labour to maintain the physical infrastructure of the ordered world. They did not command fate from a position of self-generated authority. They competed for a tablet of destinies that was already in existence when the conflict for it began. At every level of this cosmological structure, the familiar divine figures turn out to be participants within a system rather than authors of one, administrators of principles they received rather than architects of principles they designed. And the system itself, traced backward through the primordial genealogy, reaches aground Namu, the uncreated sea, the mother who gave birth to all the gods that the tradition declines to explain, not because the question did not occur to the people who maintained it, but because they appear to have understood collectively and across centuries that no explanation was available, and that pretending otherwise would be a form of intellectual dishonesty incompatible with the seriousness of the inquiry. The maturity in question is the capacity to distinguish between questions that have answers and questions that do not, and to treat the latter with the same careful attention that the former receive rather than defaulting to an improvised resolution. The Nasadya Sukta asks whether even the gods know how this began, and acknowledges they were born after. The Enuma Elish traces its genealogy to Namu and stops without apology. The Hermopolitan Okudoad names the qualities of the pre-cosmic state without accounting for their origin. Each tradition in its own form demonstrates the same recognition that the question of ultimate origins is not a question that the tradition can answer, and that saying so is the most honest thing available. What the whole landscape suggests held from sufficient distance is not that the ancient traditions were pointing toward a truth they could not quite articulate, or that they were encoding knowledge of a kind that modern scholarship has failed to recover. The suggestion is quieter than that. It is that the people who built these traditions were asking the same question that every serious inquiry into origins eventually reaches: the question of what grounds the system from outside the system, what the genealogy of existence bottoms out on when traced backward without stopping. And that their most sophisticated answer was not an answer, but a posture to hold the question carefully, to preserve it intact across generations, and to resist the comfort of a resolution that the evidence did not support. That posture is not primitive. It is not a sign of intellectual limitation. It is arguably one of the most rigorous intellectual stances available to any mind confronting a question that exceeds the reach of its own tools. The traces have been followed. The landscape has been described. What remains now is something different, a movement not outward, into more evidence, but inward toward the personal scale of what this inquiry has been circling all along, toward the question of what it means to hold ancient darkness gently in a quiet room at the edge of sleep, without demanding that it answer. The question at rest. When the inquiry becomes the answer. There is a moment in the practice of certain ancient Mesopotamian temple rituals, described in liturgical tablets from Nippur, that are among the least studied texts in the corpus, where the priest performing the ceremony was instructed to stop speaking entirely, not to pause between phrases, not to wait for a response from the assembled worshippers, but to stop and to allow the silence to occupy the space that the words had been filling. The instruction appears in the tablets as a simple notation, a sign indicating cessation, inserted into the middle of a recitation that otherwise continues on either side of it. Scholars who have encountered these notations have generally treated them as performance directions, practical guidance for the timing of ritual speech. But the placement of several of these silences appearing consistently at the points in the liturgy where the text approaches the question of what preceded the gods suggests something that may be more than a stage direction. The silence was perhaps the most accurate response available. Not an absence of meaning, but a meaning that only parents could carry. We have been following across these chapters a question that the ancient traditions themselves identified as the outermost limit of what inquiry can reach. The Anunnaki were not the beginning. The primordial pairs who preceded them were not the beginning. Even Namu, the uncreated sea, is named in the oldest Sumerian sources, without explanation, positioned at the edge of the tradition as the ground from which everything else emerges, without the tradition offering any account of what ground Namu herself stands on. 3 independent ancient cultures working without knowledge of each other's conclusions arrived at the same boundary and made the same intellectual choice to acknowledge the limit rather than construct an answer that these evidence would not support. The Nippur priests inserted influence into their liturgy at exactly this point. It is possible they understood something about the relationship between certain questions and the kind of response those questions actually require. The movement from archaeology to philosophy happens naturally when the material is followed far enough. It happened across these chapters without being forced. The 7 tablets in Ashurbanipal's library led to a theological genealogy. The genealogy led to the question of political revision and original intent. The question of intent led to the astronomical layer and the possibility of encoded celestial meaning. And all of those traces led eventually to the convergence across independent traditions, Babylonian, Vedic, Egyptian, that pointed toward the same pre-cosmic depth from three different directions without meeting each other on the way. At each stage, the inquiry moved from the specific to the general, from the datable artifact to the undatable intuition, from the question that philology can address to the question that philology can only approach before falling silent. That movement is not a failure of the inquiry. It is what happens when any sufficiently serious investigation of origins is pursued with honesty, past the point where the evidence runs out and the question continues. Philosophy becomes cosmology when the scale of the question reaches the scale of everything. The Babylonian priests who tracked processional drift from the top of Enuma, noting the slow shift of the celestial pole across centuries of patient observation, calculating where the axis of the sky would point 1,000 years hence, were not simply doing astronomy. They were measuring the rate at which the cosmos moved, and holding the implication of that measurement in a tradition that also contained a theology of primordial origins. The same minds that calculated processional cycles also composed hymns to Namu. The same institutional framework that produced eclipse prediction tables also produced the creation narrative in which the sky was formed from a dragon mother's body. These were not compartmentalized activities. They were different expressions of the same fundamental orientation toward the universe, an orientation characterized by patient attention, by the willingness to accumulate observations across timescales longer than a single lifetime, and by the conviction that what the cosmos is can be approached even if what it ultimately is cannot be reached. Your breath moving now at whatever rhythm it has settled into, in this quiet hour, participates in the same physical processes that the Mesopotamian priests were observing when they traced the movements of air and water and the slow rotation of the stars. The salt concentration in your blood is close by biochemical measurement to the concentration of the ancient ocean, a residue of the marine environment in which the earliest forms of life developed, carried forward through every subsequent evolutionary transformation into the specific body you inhabit tonight. You contain in your chemistry a memory of the primordial sea that predates the existence of any land-dwelling creature by hundreds of millions of years. Tiamat is not only a character in a Babylonian text. She is a proportion of sodium chloride maintained in your bloodstream, because the conditions of your existence trace backward through an unbroken chain of physical inheritance to water that has not existed as open ocean for geological ages, but that persists transformed and contained in the bodies of every creature that breathes air on dry land. This is not metaphor. It is biochemistry. And it is also, if the word is allowed its full weight, a kind of genealogy, the kind of genealogy the Enuma Elish was attempting to trace in the only language available to people who did not yet have biochemistry, but who understood from observation and reflection that what exists now is downstream from what existed before, and that the chain runs further back than the familiar gods, further back than the primordial pairs, into a depth that the oldest traditions addressed only by name and then fell silent. We will not resolve this tonight. That was never the purpose. The purpose was something quieter, and in its own way more useful, to follow the question carefully, to lay the traces beside each other, without forcing them into conclusions they do not support, to hold the pattern that emerges, without demanding that it resolve into proof. The ancient traditions did not resolve it either. They held it generation after generation with the same deliberate care that the scribes applied to their styluses, the specific angle of pressure, the particular rotation of the wrist, the patient attention to material that hardens as it dries and becomes permanent. They preserved the question intact because they understood that the question held with honesty was more valuable than any answer that the evidence could not support. The silence the Nipper priests inserted into their liturgy at the outermost limit of the tradition is still available. It has been waiting in the space between these words, in the intervals between thoughts, in the particular quality of attention that arrives when a mind has been following something long enough that it stops pushing and begins instead to listen. The question does not require an answer tonight. It requires only the quality of attention that allows it to be held without weight, for the way water holds the reflection of a star without needing to understand what a star is. The last image is waiting in the next chapter. It is a specific physical thing held briefly in the silence before sleep arrives. The tablet that has not yet been read. In the basement storage of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, there are shelves containing cuneiform tablets that have not been fully studied. This is not a figure of speech or an approximation. It is a documented institutional reality tablets recovered from excavations at Eridu Nippur and dozens of smaller Mesopotamian sites catalogued and stored, awaiting the attention of scholars who have not yet reached them. Some of these tablets have been in storage for more than 70 years. Some were catalogued before the Second World War and have not been examined in detail since. The field of Assyriology is a small one, a few hundred active researchers worldwide at any given time, and the volume of surviving material exceeds what the field can process within any foreseeable time frame. There are, by the most conservative estimates, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets in institutional collections around the world whose contents remain either partially or entirely unknown. Consider what that means for the inquiry this series has been following. The creation traditions examined across these chapters, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, the Nippur Divine Assembly, records the hymns to Namu, represent the recovered and studied portion of a record that was in its original form vastly larger. The theological traditions that reached the boundary of the primordial depth and fell silent there were maintained by institutions that produced far more material than has survived, and far more material than has been read among what survives. The question of what the oldest Mesopotamian traditions understood about the nature of the pre-cosmic state, whether they held it as pure theological allegory, or as encoded astronomical observation, or as the honest acknowledgement of a limit that no available concept could cross, may have answers in tablets that are sitting right now in basement storage, their surfaces carrying impressions made by hands that pressed reed into wet clay more than 3,000 years ago, waiting for a reader who has not yet arrived. This is not a dramatic observation. It is simply a fact about the state of the record, and it is worth holding quietly for a moment rather than moving past it. The material we have been following is not the complete tradition. It's what survived the burning of Nineveh, the flooding of the abandonment of Eridu, the looting of the Iraq Museum during the 2003 invasion, the slow erosion of unexcavated sites across southern Iraq, where the water table has risen, and the mud brick has softened, and the tablets within it have gradually returned to the undifferentiated clay from which they were made. What remains is a fraction of what was made, and what has been read is a fraction of what remains. The tradition that traced the genealogy of existence to its outermost limit and then fell silent at the edge of the uncreated sea may have had more to say in texts that no modern eye has read in passages, that no translation has yet rendered in impressions pressed into the clay that has spent 3 millennia waiting in the dark. There is a tablet in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, not CBS 10673, which has been studied extensively, but a smaller, less complete fragment catalogued in an adjacent series that has been partially transliterated but not fully published. Specialists who have examined it note that it appears to contain cosmological material possibly related to the Eridu tradition, possibly earlier in certain formal features than the comparable published texts. They note this in footnotes in passing references in longer studies addressed to other questions. The tablet itself sits in its storage tray, its surface bearing signs that someone pressed into wet clay with deliberate care, intending them to be read in a room somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, in lamplight, in a building that no longer exists above the ground it occupied. What those signs say is not yet fully known. They may say nothing that revises the tradition as it has been reconstructed from better preserved sources. They may contain a variant, a parallel account, a theological reflection that the better-known texts do not include. They may contain the ordinary administrative content that constitutes the majority of the cuneiform corpus, ration lists, land transfers, temple inventories, and have been misidentified as cosmological material by a scholar working quickly through a large catalogue. The point is not that the fragment is necessarily significant. The point is that the record is still open, still partially unread, still containing impressions made by human hands in material that hardened and waited, and survived, carrying whatever it carries into a present that has not yet found time to look at it carefully. Sleep, when it arrives, works by a mechanism that neuroscience can describe in considerable detail: the gradual withdrawal of the thalamus's relay functions, the shift of cortical activity from the high-frequency patterns of waking attention to the slower oscillations of early sleep, the consolidation of the day's experiences into longer-term memory structures during the deeper stages that follow. What neuroscience cannot yet fully account for is the subjective texture of that threshold, the specific quality of the moment when waking thought loosens, and the mind, no longer maintaining the distinctions that structure the day, moves towards something that resembles in its own small way the state the Enuma Elish described as prior to naming, not unconsciousness, not absence. The undifferentiated fullness that precedes the separation of one thing from another, the interval before the categories reassert themselves and the day begins again. The Nippur priests fell scint at this boundary in their liturgy. The Vedic hymn asked whether even the gods knew what existed before them. The Hermopolitan tradition named the qualities of the pre-cosmic state and offered nothing behind them. The tablet in the Pennsylvania Museum basement holds its impressions in the dark. The 7 tablets from Ashurbanipal's burning library rest in their cases in Bloomsbury, carrying the marks of fire that preserved what it destroyed. And the primordial waters that the oldest traditions placed at the outermost edge of the genealogy of existence continue, in the biochemistry of every sleeping body, to hold the proportions of the ancient sea that no individual life remembers, but that every living cell has never in the full span of biological time entirely left. Rest now, traveller, 7 tablets. That is where this began, 7 fired clay rectangles, each roughly the size of a human palm, recovered from a room that had been sealed for 24 centuries beneath the ruins of Nineveh. We opened with that image because it is grounded, because it is specific, because it is the kind of thing that can be held in the hands. But having followed the question, those tablets carry backward through the divine genealogy, through the political reshaping of Tiamat's portrait, through the astronomical layer encoded in the mythology, through the convergence of 3 independent traditions at the same pre-cosmic silence. The image of those 7 tablets looks different now than it did at the beginning. Not larger exactly, more transparent, as if the clay has thinned enough to let the lamplight through from the other side. What was pressed into those tablets by hands working in an Edubba in Babylon sometime around 1100 BCE was not the original thought. It was a copy of a copy of a copy, each iteration moving the tradition further from whatever experiences or observations or transmitted memories first gave rise to it, and further into the institutional care of people who preserved it, because they understood without being able to fully explain why that its loss would cost something that could not be recovered. We are reading tonight the shadow of a shadow. The original light that cast it has been gone for longer than writing has existed to record how long. This is not a reason for disappointment. It is simply the condition of all inquiry into very old things, the condition that the record is always partial, always filtered through the intentions and limitations of the people who carried it forward, always reaching us as a fragment of something larger that we can sense but not fully reconstruct. The genealogy of the gods traced in the Enuma Elish may be theology or allegory or encoded astronomy or the residue of oral traditions older than the cities that eventually wrote them down. It may be all of these simultaneously in proportions that no surviving text makes fully clear. The honest position held all the way through this inquiry is that the question of what the oldest traditions actually knew and intended cannot be settled from the evidence that remains. That uncertainty is not a failure of the inquiry. It is the inquiry's most accurate finding. There are tablets in storage tonight that have not been read. Impressions pressed into clay by hands that are dust in buildings, that are sand-carrying signs whose meaning may revise or confirm or quietly complicate everything that has been traced here. They are waiting in the dark, the way the question itself has always waited patient, in the way that only material things can be patient without awareness of the waiting, without urgency, without the need for the reader to arrive on any particular schedule. Perhaps the tradition already knew what it could not say, that the question of what preceded the uncreated sea is the question that stops all questions. Not because it has an answer too large to speak, but because it marks the place where the very act of questioning requires a questioner, and the questioner is always already inside the system they are trying to see from outside. Whatever drew you here tonight, curiosity or the simple need for a voice to accompany the dissolving of the day, the questions followed in this space are yours to keep or release as sleep decides. They were old before any tradition thought to write them down. They will be old long after the last copy of the oldest text has returned to the earth it came from. The room around you holds its particular darkness. Your breath continues its rhythm without requiring instruction. The proportions of the ancient sea maintained in your blood since before your kind walked on dry land keep their quiet balance in the dark. Somewhere in the flat terrain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, beneath several meters of accumulated sediment and silence, The ruins of Eridu hold the foundations of 18 temples, built one atop another across 3,000 years, each generation constructing its sanctuary on the remains of the one before each one, so there's certain enough of the location's significance to begin again, rather than move elsewhere, none of them leaving a record of what precisely they understood to be present in that particular ground. The night holds all of this without effort, the way it has always held what the day could not contain. Let it hold you now as well. Traveller, not toward any answer, not toward any conclusion, but toward the particular stillness that the oldest traditions placed at the beginning of everything before the first separation, before the first name, before the first question, reach the edge of what questions can do. The deep is patient. It has never stopped waiting for you to return to it. Sleep well, sleep.